At my sister's wedding, Mom laughed loudly. No wonder you're 35 and still single. The string quartet froze mid-note. Every head at the table turned toward me, waiting for my reaction like it was part of the entertainment. I felt the sting before the laughter even reached my ears. My mother's perfectly manicured hand rested on her champagne glass, the diamonds catching the light as she smirked. Across the table, my sister Sophie looked mortified, her new husband Andrew, whispering something in her ear to calm her down. The laughter swelled, awkward but complicit. I raised my own glass, my smile steady though my stomach churned. "Actually, Mom," I said softly, my voice carrying farther than I expected, "I'm not single." The room quieted. A fork clinked against a plate. Mom's smile froze halfway, the corner of her mouth twitching. "Darling," she said, with that patronizing tone she used on sales clerks, "don't start joking at your sister's wedding." But I didn't look away. I set my glass down carefully. "I'm not joking." And then the ballroom doors opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Rewind 3 days earlier, when I first landed in Charleston for this circus of perfection my mother called a wedding. The humidity clung to my skin like regret. The family mansion was draped in white lilies and silk ribbons, every corner curated to scream old money charm. Mom Evelyn Mitchell had outdone herself as always. She met me on the front porch, her blonde hair in its signature twist, her pearl earrings gleaming. "Lauren, darling," she said, kissing the air near my cheek, "you look tired. San Francisco must be hard on you." "Still no one special," I smiled tightly, the same way I always did when she handed me an insult disguised as concern. "Work keeps me busy," I said. She sighed theatrically, the way only Evelyn could. "Career women," she muttered, leading me inside. "They think independence is a personality trait." Inside, Sophie floated down the staircase in her bridal robe, glowing like the human embodiment of approval. "Lauren," she squealed, hugging me, "I'm so glad you're here. Mom said you might be too busy." I shot Mom a look. She just shrugged, pretending innocence. Sophie was the golden daughter, sweet, compliant, forever orbiting Mom's expectations, like a devoted satellite. And I loved her despite it all. She never weaponized her perfection the way Mom did. Still standing beside her always made me feel like a background character in someone else's photo. That evening, during the rehearsal dinner, Mom's social circle gathered like royalty judges, country club friends, her bridge partners' sons. Every time she introduced me, it came with a qualifier. "This is my older daughter, Lauren. She lives out west." Her tone made out west sound like in exile. I smiled through it, counting the minutes until I could escape. Ethan called just before dessert, his voice warm and grounding. "How's the battlefield?" he teased. I stepped outside onto the veranda, lowering my voice. "You have no idea. She's in rare form." "You could just tell her," he said gently. "End it." I stared at the manicured lawn glinting under the moonlight. "Not here," I whispered. "Not at Sophie's wedding. She'd never forgive me." "Maybe she's not the one who needs forgiving," he said before the line went quiet. The next morning I woke to the sound of laughter downstairs. Mom and her friends were arranging the seating chart, sipping mimosas, gossiping about people who weren't present. "Put Lauren at table 9, I heard Mom say, next to the single cousins. She'll be comfortable." A burst of laughter followed. I closed my eyes, willing the anger to pass. I'd spent years perfecting the art of not reacting. Evelyn Mitchell's eldest daughter trained in silent endurance. When the ceremony began, I watched Sophie glide down the aisle under a canopy of magnolias, radiant and trembling. Mom dabbed fake tears with her monogrammed handkerchief, stealing glances to make sure the photographers caught her at flattering angles. Ethan's text buzzed in my clutch. "Thinking of you." Just seeing his name steadied me. My secret anchor. My real life waiting 3,000 miles away. The reception was a symphony of perfection. Crystal chandeliers, string music, champagne fountains. Mom glided from table to table, the queen of appearances. When it was time for toasts, she rose gracefully, clinking her glass. To Sophie and Andrew, she began a match made in heaven and a reminder that some of us still know how to prioritize family and love. People chuckled politely. I felt the blood rush to my ears. She wasn't even subtle. As everyone laughed, she turned to me, her smile sharp as glass. Lauren, dear, take notes. Maybe you'll be next if you ever stop being so independent. The word dripped with disdain. I could have stayed quiet. I'd done it all my life. But something inside me snapped. A tiny, trembling voice that had been silent since childhood finally stood up. I lifted my glass the same way she had taught me, chin high, wrist delicate. Actually, Mom, I said, each syllable clear and calm, I'm not single. The laughter faltered. I heard someone cough. Evelyn blinked twice, the smile on her lips stiffening. Oh, Lauren, she said, tone syrupy, you're so dramatic. I tilted my head. You said drama runs in the family. A murmur rippled through the guests. Sophie's eyes widened silently, begging me to stop. But I couldn't. I'd spent 3 years hiding behind politeness. Tonight I chose truth. Then the doors at the end of the hall opened. The light from the chandeliers spilled across the marble floor, and there he was. Ethan, in a gray suit, calm, composed, the very image of quiet strength. Gasps swept the room. Mom's laughter died on her lips. She knew that face. It took her a moment to place it, the man she once dismissed as the engineer with no future. Ethan walked toward me, unhurried, eyes locked on mine. Every step sounded like a heartbeat. When he reached the table, he slid his arm around my waist, the motion so natural, so certain. Sorry I'm late, he said lightly, but the words hung heavy in the stunned silence. I had to make sure our daughter was asleep before I caught a flight. Mom's face drained of color. Our what? She whispered. Ethan smiled politely. Our daughter, Ella. She turned 2 last month. No one breathed. The air felt thick enough to drown in. My mother opened, her mouth closed. It then looked at the guests, people she'd spent decades impressing. This is absurd, she stammered. You can't possibly. I can, I said quietly. And I do. I turned to the room, my voice steadier than I felt. Everyone, this is my husband, Ethan Parker. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then, somewhere near the back, a fork dropped onto a plate, and the sound shattered the spell. Conversations erupted in whispers. Mom sank back into her chair, her expressions somewhere between rage and disbelief. Sophie stood, frozen, tears in her eyes. Ethan squeezed my hand, grounding me. Let's go, he murmured. I nodded, turning once more toward my mother. You always said I'd embarrass the family one day, I said softly. Looks like you were right. We walked out together through the same doors he had entered, the music resuming behind us in shaky fragments. Outside, the night air hit me like freedom, cool, clean, mercifully silent. Ethan exhaled beside me. You did it, he whispered. I laughed through the tears. No, I said, my voice breaking, but free we did. Behind us, I could still hear the murmurs, the chaos, the fallout beginning. But for the first time in years, I didn't care what my mother thought or what anyone thought. For the first time, the truth belonged to me. Growing up in Charleston, I learned early that love in our house came with conditions. You had to earn it, perform it, perfect it. My mother, Evelyn Mitchell, ran our family like a country club committee, strict dress codes, perfect posture, and absolutely no room for mistakes. My sister Sophie was her shining star, the golden child who fit perfectly into that polished mold. I, on the other hand, was the smudge on the silver. Some of my earliest memories are of Sunday mornings when the whole neighborhood would stream into St. Matthew's Church. Sophie, 6 years old, and angelic, played the piano in her lace dress, while Mom beamed from the front pew. I was 8, fidgeting next to her, my shoes too tight, my dress itching my skin. When I accidentally dropped my hymn book, the echo rang through the hall like a crime. After service, she bent down, her smile frozen, whispering through clenched teeth. You make everything harder than it has to be, Lauren. At home, perfection wasn't a goal, it was survival. Breakfast was served on fine china even on school days. Sophie would sit across from me, hair brushed into glossy curls while I struggled to tame my frizz. "Sit straight," Mom would remind me, tapping my shoulder with her spoon. "Sophie dear, pass the jam. See how gracefully your sister could learn from you?" I'd smile because that's what kept the peace. Dad would wink at me over his newspaper, a silent apology. He was gentle, soft-spoken, the only cushion between Mom's standards and my rebellion. But when I was 15, his heart gave out one evening after work. I still remember the way Mom didn't cry at the hospital. She just stood there stiff and immaculate, as if tears were an indulgence she couldn't afford. At the funeral, she clasped my shoulder and whispered, "From now on, you'll have to be perfect for both of us." I wanted to scream, but I nodded instead. From that day forward, my mother's control became absolute. Report cards turned into performance reviews. Every A- came with a lecture. Every friendship was vetted for appropriate family background. She chose my clothes, my friends, even my ambitions. "Harvard doesn't take girls who settle for mediocrity," she'd remind me whenever I looked tired. I started to live two lives. One at school where I could breathe for a few hours, and one at home where every breath felt measured. Sophie, 3 years younger, was everything. I wasn't graceful, obedient, charming. She knew how to say exactly what Mom wanted to hear. "Mom says I'm her little mirror," she'd giggle once, twirling in the kitchen. I just smiled and washed the dishes. Inside, resentment built like steam behind glass. I didn't hate Sophie. I envied her ease, her ability to exist without being questioned. I wished I could trade places just for a day to know what it felt like to be enough. The comparisons never stopped. Sophie got an A in English. "What happened to your essay? Sophie's dress fits her so nicely. Maybe you should try something less daring." I began to anticipate the criticism before she said it, editing myself constantly. By the time I was 17, I could read her face like a weather forecast. One raised brow meant change your tone. A sigh meant you've already disappointed me. During my senior prom, I wore a navy gown I'd saved for months to buy with my own paycheck from the library. The minute she saw me, she tilted her head. "That color makes your hips look wide." I remember standing there clutching my clutch bag, feeling myself shrink inch by inch. "Mom," I said quietly, "can you just let me feel pretty for one night?" She smiled coldly. "You're beautiful when you try, darling. Don't waste it." It was in those moments I began to understand that love for her was transactional. She didn't mean to be cruel. She just didn't know another way to exist. Her validation was the currency of my worth, and I spent years going bankrupt. Sophie's path, of course, was paved in approval. She joined the same charity boards Mom did, dated the sons of family friends, and smiled at the right people at the right time. "She's such a lady," Mom would gush to anyone who'd listen, just like me at her age. Then, like a reflex, she'd add, "Lauren's the ambitious one." The way she said ambitious made it sound like contagious arrogance. When I got accepted into the University of Southern California for communications, Mom nearly choked on her coffee. "California," she said, as if I'd confessed to joining a cult. "Why would you move across the country to study public relations? You could study law right here." I tried to explain that I wanted to tell stories to connect people, to live in color. She shook her head. "PR is for girls who can't make real careers." That night I overheard her on the phone with her sister Lauren. Always was the difficult one. So much potential, but no sense of direction. I sat in my room, staring at the acceptance letter on my bed, and realized I'd never win her approval, not because I wasn't enough, but because she needed me to fail to keep her world balanced. Sophie's perfection required my imperfection to shine. I left for college with a single suitcase and a silent promise I'd build a life far enough away that her voice couldn't reach me. She hugged me goodbye at the airport, stiff and formal, her perfume sharp in my throat. "Don't forget where you come from," she said. I wanted to tell her that was exactly what I intended to do. College was chaos, but it was freedom. For the first time, I chose my clothes without a critique waiting at the breakfast table. I cut my hair short, painted my apartment walls teal, and learned how to laugh without apology. But even from 3,000 miles away, Mom's voice followed me through the phone. "You sound tired, darling. Are you eating well? You know Sophie's boyfriend just proposed. She's such a catch." Each call was a reminder of the life I'd escaped and the guilt of having escaped it. I'd hang up and stare at the ceiling, torn between relief and sadness. Despite everything, a part of me still wanted her to say, "I'm proud of you." That's the cruel trick of toxic love. It makes you crave the poison because you mistake it for nourishment. Sophie sent me photos of her engagement ring, the beach house. Andrew's parents bought them the wedding dress fittings. Every picture came with a caption full of exclamation marks and hidden pity. "Wish you were here," I smiled, typed back heart emojis, then threw my phone across the bed. It wasn't her fault, but the shadow she cast was suffocating. Mom's approval of Sophie's life only deepened her disapproval of mine. "You'll end up alone, Lauren," she said one day when I visited home for Christmas. "No man wants a woman who challenges everything." I laughed bitterly. "Maybe I don't want that kind of man." Her eyes narrowed. "That's exactly what women say before they realize they've made a mistake." That Christmas was the last time I spent more than a weekend in Charleston. When I flew back to California, I looked out the airplane window and whispered to the clouds, "No more. No more bending to fit. No more apologizing for who I was." The city by the bay welcomed me like a clean slate. I rented a tiny apartment in the Mission District, its walls cracked but full of light. I took a job at a small PR firm called Stellar Image, working late hours, surviving on ramen and ambition. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Each morning when I walked to work past the smell of coffee and the sound of streetcars, I felt the invisible chains of Charleston loosen link by link. Sometimes, though, when the city grew quiet and fog rolled in, I'd hear her voice again, sharp, elegant, echoing in my head. "Sit up straight. Smile politely. Don't be so emotional." It took years before that voice began to fade. And it took meeting Ethan before I realized I didn't have to silence it. I just had to stop listening. Back then, I didn't know that love could be gentle. I didn't know that being seen didn't have to hurt. I only knew that somewhere, far away from Charleston, from the manicured lawns and perfect daughters, I might finally learn how to be enough. And one day, I would find someone who didn't need me to prove it. The airplane lifted off from Charleston just as the sun dipped below the clouds, streaking the sky with orange and pink. I pressed my forehead to the window and watched the city shrink into a pattern of rooftops and water until it was nothing but a memory. I thought leaving would feel like freedom. Instead, it felt like betrayal. Mom's last words still echoed in my head. "You'll come back once you realize the world isn't impressed by rebellion." I whispered to the clouds, "We'll see." When the plane landed in San Francisco, the air felt colder, sharper, alive with movement. The cab ride from the airport took me through streets that looked nothing like Charleston murals on walls, strangers laughing on sidewalks, fog curling through the hills like ghosts. My new apartment sat above a tiny bookstore in the Mission District. It was small, uneven, and perfect. For the first time, silence didn't mean tension, it meant peace. That first night, I sat on the floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes, eating takeout Chinese from a carton. The light from the street lamps filtered through the blinds, painting gold stripes across the walls. I thought of Mom's house, the polished floors, the antique vases, the way everything smelled like lemon polish and rules. Here, the air smelled like garlic noodles and possibility. I promised myself I'd never go back, not until I became someone she couldn't criticize. Days turned into weeks, and the city slowly began to feel like mine. I learned to walk fast, to hold my coffee with confidence, to smile at strangers who didn't ask what family I came from. I found a small circle of friends from work who shared cheap wine and big dreams. My job at Stellar Image was demanding but thrilling. I was the youngest communications associate there, and my boss, Maya Torres, was everything. Mom said a woman shouldn't be bold, unapologetic, powerful. "You're sharper than you think," she told me once. "Don't let the people who raised you decide how far you go." At first, I kept my head down, terrified of failure. Every email I sent, every campaign idea I pitched, I could hear Mom's voice judging it. Too risky, too loud, too you. But something about San Francisco loosened me. Maybe it was the fog that blurred the edges of everything, or the smell of the ocean that made even mistakes feel forgivable. I was still cautious, but I was learning. And then one morning I met him. I was late for a meeting, juggling a coffee cup and a stack of reports as I turned down a hallway that all looked the same. I slammed straight into someone. My latte exploded across a stranger's blue shirt. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I gasped, fumbling for napkins. The man looked down at himself, then back up at me, and smiled a real easy smile that didn't feel like judgment. "Guess this shirt was living on borrowed time," he said, brushing it off. He extended his hand. "Ethan Parker, software consultant, part-time stain magnet." I laughed, despite myself shaking his hand. "Lauren Mitchell, professional mess." He guided me to the right conference room. Turns out he was our new client brought in to help with the tech partnership campaign. After the meeting, he lingered by my desk. "Since you owe me a coffee," he said, "maybe I should let you buy me a new one." That coffee became lunch, and lunch turned into small walks after work. He wasn't like the men Mom would have approved of. His shirts were always slightly wrinkled, his hair never perfectly combed, but he listened. He had a calmness about him, a steadiness that made silence feel comfortable instead of heavy. We talked about everything: books, travel, childhoods. He grew up in Oregon, the son of a high school teacher and a nurse. He'd put himself through college, fixing computers and waiting tables. "My parents taught me that success isn't a title," he said once, staring out at the bay. "It's sleeping at night without regrets." I smiled but said nothing. My version of success was still tangled with my mother's approval, and I didn't have the courage to admit that. One evening, a few months later, our team hosted an after-hours happy hour downtown. The office was buzzing, drinks in hand, stories flying. Ethan and I ended up outside on the balcony, the city glittering below us. The wind tangled my hair, and I tucked it behind my ear nervously. "You ever think about going back?" he asked. "Back where? Home?" I took a deep breath. "Charleston stopped being home a long time ago." He nodded. "What happened?" I hesitated, unsure where to start. "My mom has a way of making everything feel like a competition. Even love. That sounds exhausting." "It is." He leaned against the railing, watching me instead of the skyline. "You don't have to prove anything you know." His words were simple, but they hit harder than any lecture my mother ever gave. No one had ever told me that before, not my teachers, not my friends, not even my father. A few weeks later, he showed up at my desk with a small wrapped box. Inside was a camera, a vintage Nikon, sleek and beautiful. "You said once you used to love photography," he said. "Maybe you should start again." I stared at it, stunned. "Why would you buy me this?" "Because life's too short not to do what you love," he said, grinning. "Even if it's just on weekends." That weekend, we took a day trip down the coast to Monterey. I took pictures of everything: the cliffs, the waves, the sunlight glinting off his hair. He teased me, saying I looked happier behind the camera than in front of it. "You should frame that one," he said, pointing to a shot of the ocean at sunset. "I might," I said, though I never did. Instead, I printed it and pinned it inside my closet where no one else could see. We grew closer, quietly. There were no grand gestures, just moments: his hand finding mine during late-night walks, the way he listened when I talked about Dad, the way he never tried to fix me. Once, when I mentioned how Mom never liked when I laughed too loudly, he said, "Then laugh louder." The more time we spent together, the more I felt the tension between who I was with him and who I was raised to be. Around Ethan, I was light, unguarded. Around Mom, even on the phone, I was still that careful, edited version of myself. Every Sunday, Evelyn would call. Her voice came through crisp and sharp, even from across the country. "You sound tired, darling. Are you taking care of yourself?" Sophie says. "Andrew just got promoted." "That's great for her," I'd say. "And what about you? Met anyone respectable yet respectable?" That word again. I'd glance at Ethan, barefoot in my kitchen, humming as he cooked. No one you'd know, I'd reply. It became our ritual. I'd hang up exhale and Ethan would hand me a plate of pasta like a peace offering. How bad was it this time, he'd ask. She compared me to Sophie again. He'd smile softly. At least she's consistent. We'd laugh, but inside I was shrinking again. I didn't tell him how much her disapproval still haunted me. How even when she wasn't in the room, she shaped the way I moved, the way I spoke. He thought I'd escaped her. I thought so too until the first time she visited. She called one morning, her tone deceptively sweet. I'll be in San Francisco for a charity luncheon. We should have dinner. I stared at the phone for a long time after hanging up. Ethan looked up from his laptop. Everything okay? My mom's coming. He smiled, oblivious. Great, I'll finally get to meet her. The blood drained from my face. No, I said quickly. She can be difficult. Lauren, he said gently, I love you. Your mom might not approve of me right away, but that's okay. We'll figure it out together. I wanted to believe him. I really did. When the day came, I spent hours preparing him. She'll ask questions about your job, your family, your future. Just don't let her get to you. He kissed my forehead. I'll be fine. But deep down, I knew my mother's approval wasn't something anyone survived unscathed. That night, as I sat across from Ethan in a quiet restaurant waiting for her to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. I'd built a new life 3,000 miles away, but somehow she was already here, her judgment like perfume in the air, invisible but impossible to escape. And when she finally walked in, impeccable poised, the same scent of Chanel trailing behind her, I knew this dinner would change everything. The restaurant glowed in warm candlelight, every table neatly set with white linen and crystal glasses. Ethan looked relaxed, smiling at me from across the table, completely unaware of the emotional landmine that was about to detonate. I had chosen a quiet place, neutral ground, or so I thought. But when my mother walked in, even the air seemed to tense around her. Evelyn Mitchell always made an entrance. Heads turned as she crossed the room, her beige suit pressed to perfection, pearls gleaming like armor. She stopped beside our table, assessing Ethan with one quick glance before offering her hand. You must be Ethan, she said, voice sugar-dipped steel. Lauren's told me so. Little about you. Ethan stood polite as ever, shaking her hand. It's nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Mitchell. Her grip lingered just long enough to establish dominance. Please call me Evelyn. She sat down without waiting for us to do the same. I felt the ground shift. Ethan smiled, trying to ease the tension. Lauren speaks very highly of you. She's always been dramatic, Mom replied, unfolding her napkin. I'm sure she exaggerated. Ethan blinked, but his expression stayed calm. I watched him, willing him not to take the bait. When the waiter came to take our order, Mom inspected the menu like it offended her. Do they not have Chilean sea bass, she asked. No matter. I'll take the halibut. Well done. And a glass of Chardonnay, something decent, please. Ethan ordered salmon. I asked for water. The silence stretched until she broke it. So Ethan, Lauren says you work with computers. I do, he said easily. I help businesses design systems that make their work simpler. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. How practical. Is there much of a future in that sort of thing? Technology's growing fast, Ethan said. I love what I do. Mom nodded slowly. Of course. Loving what you do is important, though it's rarely enough to pay the bills. Mom, I said quietly. She ignored me. Where did you study, Ethan? Oregon State, he replied. Her eyebrows arched ever so slightly. A state school. How quaint. I kicked her gently under the table. Mom. She sighed, pretending innocence. What, I'm simply curious. Ethan met her gaze without flinching. It's a good school, he said evenly. I worked my way through. Scholarships, part-time jobs. Taught me a lot about persistence. Mom dabbed her lips with her napkin. That's admirable. Though I always believed a young man should focus on building connections early. Family circles, the right mentors, it all matters. I guess I just focused on learning instead, he said lightly. She smiled the kind of smile that meant she'd already decided he was beneath her. Well, not everyone can afford to be idealistic forever. The rest of dinner was a blur of small talk laced with subtle insults. She asked about his income disguised as curiosity about career stability. She mentioned the fine young men I'd known in Charleston, lawyers, bankers, sons of her friends, and sighed about how time just flies when people make responsible choices. Ethan kept his composure the entire time. I, however, felt the familiar burn of humiliation crawling up my neck. Every sentence she spoke pulled me back to being 16, sitting at the dinner table while she compared me to Sophie. When Ethan excused himself to use the restroom, Mom leaned across the table. "Darling," she said softly, "he's nice enough for now. But you're 32. You can't keep wasting your best years on experiments." My jaw tightened. "He's not an experiment." Her tone stayed calm, deliberate. "Lauren, he's charming, yes. But where is this headed marriage children? He doesn't come from our world. You'd end up supporting him within 5 years. I stared at her. Why does it matter where he comes from if he treats me right? She gave me a pitying look. Because love doesn't pay the mortgage. And you deserve stability. I laughed bitterly. No, Mom. You mean I deserve status? Her face hardened. Don't raise your voice. When Ethan returned, I forced a smile, but he saw through it. His hand brushed mine under the table, a small act of comfort. Mom noticed. "Well," she said brightly, "it's lovely to see my daughter finally smiling." "You must be a miracle worker, Ethan." He met her gaze. "She's easy to make happy. You just have to let her be herself." Her fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Is that so?" He nodded, unflinching. "Yes, ma'am. She's one of the most genuine people I've ever met." For a second, something flickered in her eyes. Maybe surprise, maybe envy. Then she set her fork down delicately. "How nice," she said coldly. The check arrived soon after. She reached for it before Ethan could. "Please, this is my city," he smiled. "Then thank you for dinner." When we stepped outside, the night air felt merciful. I could finally breathe again. Ethan took my hand. "You okay? She hated you." He squeezed my fingers. "I've been hated before." I looked up at him. "You didn't deserve that." He smiled sadly. "Neither did you." We walked in silence until we reached his car. I leaned against the door, tears stinging my eyes. "She'll never accept you." He wiped a tear from my cheek with his thumb. "That's okay. I didn't fall in love with your mother." I laughed through the tears. "She's going to make our lives hell. Then we'll build a life where she can't reach," he said simply. I wanted to believe him, but Mom had a way of reaching places she wasn't invited. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake replaying every word she said, every judgment disguised as advice. Around 2 in the morning, I called her. The phone rang twice before she picked up.
"What is it, Lauren?"
"Why do you do that?" I asked quietly. "Why do you make everyone feel small?" "I don't make anyone feel small," she said sharply. "If people can't handle honesty, that's not my fault. Honesty isn't cruelty." Silence crackled across the line. Then she said, "If you choose to throw your life away on that man, don't come crying to me when it falls apart." I swallowed hard. Maybe I won't need to. The line went dead. The next morning, Ethan made coffee, humming softly. "Rough night," she gave me a choice, I said. "Between what her approval and my life." He looked at me over his mug. "Then choose life." Later that week, she called again, pretending nothing had happened. "I've been thinking," she began, "perhaps you should meet James Whitmore. He just made partner in his father's firm. Very ambitious." I almost laughed. "Mom, I already have someone. I'm not talking about now. I'm talking about your future. Do you really think this? Ethan will be able to provide." "Stop it," I snapped. "You don't know him." "I know his type," she said, her voice dripping with certainty. "Dreamers. They always leave you with the bills." I hung up. That night I told Ethan what she'd said. He listened quietly, then wrapped his arms around me. "She doesn't get to decide what love looks like for us," he whispered. She'll never stop trying, I said. Then she'll lose, he replied simply. He kissed my forehead, and for a moment I let myself believe that love could be enough. But deep down, a quiet dread lingered. I knew my mother, she'd never surrender control, and the harder I tried to build a life of my own, the more determined she'd be to destroy it. I looked at Ethan as he drifted off to sleep beside me, his arms still around my waist. The city outside glowed faintly through the curtains, and for the first time since dinner, I smiled. Love wasn't about perfection, it was about peace. I didn't realize then that peace with Ethan would come at the price of war with my mother, and that one day soon she would force me to choose which mattered more. It started with what my mother called a little surprise. Her voice on the phone was syrupy sweet, the kind she used when she'd already decided what was best for me. I thought we could have dinner next week, she said. Just you, me, and an old friend of the family. You remember James Whitmore, don't you? I stared at the phone like it had bitten me. No, I don't think so. Oh, of course you do, she continued. The Whitmores were at the country club with us years ago. James is in San Francisco for a conference. Newly single, successful, very grounded. I thought you two might enjoy catching up. Mom, I'm not interested in being set up. Who said anything about that? She laughed, the sound hollow. It's just dinner. Be gracious, Lauren. You used to be. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to shout that I was already married. But instead I said fine. One dinner. Because part of me still clung to the ridiculous hope that if I did things her way just once, maybe she'd see I wasn't the failure she believed I was. When I told Ethan, he just looked at me for a long moment. You're kidding, right? She ambushed me. I didn't want to start another war. He set his coffee mug down. Lauren, you don't owe her obedience. You don't have to keep proving yourself. I tried to smile. It's one dinner. I'll survive. He exhaled, frustrated. I trust you. I just don't trust her. The restaurant she chose was the kind with white tablecloths and soft piano music. When I walked in, she was already there, radiating control. James, sitting across from her, a man in his mid-30s, with perfect posture and an expensive watch. Lauren, she said brightly, standing to kiss my cheek. You look lovely, doesn't she, James? James nodded politely. Your mother's told me so much about you. I forced a smile. I'll bet. We sat, and within minutes I realized this wasn't dinner, it was an audition. Mom paraded my achievements like bullet points on a resume. Lauren graduated summa cum laude from USC, you know. She could have gone to law school, but she's exploring her options. I clenched my jaw. I have a career, Mom. Of course, darling, she said quickly, waving it off. But you're still young. There's time to pivot. James shifted uncomfortably. So, Lauren, you work in public relations. I lead communications for a tech firm. Mom laughed, cutting in. She's always been good with words. Just like her father, though he had trouble turning them into profit. I froze. Don't talk about Dad like that. She sipped her wine unbothered. I'm just saying you're both dreamers. It's endearing. James coughed and changed the subject. So what kind of firm is it? Before I could answer, she did. Something with computers. I never quite understand what she does. I wanted to disappear. I excused myself under the pretense of the restroom and texted Ethan. She did it again. Want me to come get you? He wrote back. Please don't, I replied. It'll only make it worse. When I returned to the table, Mom was recounting a story from my high school years, something about my rebellious phase. James looked trapped. Mom, that's enough, I said sharply. Her eyes flicked toward me, cool and warning. Don't be rude. I'm not, I said. I'm setting a boundary. The air thickened. She smiled at James. She gets this from her father. Always dramatic. That was it. I pushed my chair back. I'm done. Lauren, she snapped. Sit down. No, I said, voice shaking but steady. I'm tired of being your project. Heads turned from nearby tables. Mom's face flushed with anger. Don't make a scene. Too late, I said, grabbing my purse. I walked out without looking back. My hands trembled all the way to the car. By the time I reached our apartment, Ethan was waiting by the window. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He just opened his arms. "She's never going to stop," I whispered into his chest. He kissed the top of my head. "Then maybe it's time we stopped letting her." But I didn't know how. My mother had a way of pulling strings, even from 3,000 miles away. The next week she called daily. "You embarrassed me," she said on the third call. "Poor James didn't know what to think. I'm sure he'll recover. Don't be flippant, Lauren. You can't keep burning bridges." "I'm not burning them, Mom. I'm just not living on them anymore." A pause, then the sigh I'd known since childhood. "You always were ungrateful." I hung up. That evening, I came home to find Ethan on the couch, laptop open, stress written across his face. "What's wrong?" I asked. He hesitated, then turned the screen toward me. "Your mom emailed me." My stomach dropped. What? He nodded grimly. "She got my company address somehow. Said she wanted to clear the air." I read the message. It was short and surgical. "I hope you understand that my daughter is impressionable. She's been through a lot. Please don't let this turn into another mistake she regrets." I stared at the words until they blurred. "She's trying to drive us apart." Ethan closed the laptop. "I'm not going anywhere." But her interference had already started to crack something fragile between us. Over the next few weeks, small arguments replaced laughter. He'd say, "You can't keep letting her control you," and I'd snap, "You don't know what it's like." He'd pull away. I'd cry after he fell asleep. One night after another of Mom's surprise calls, I lost it. "She won't stop," I shouted, pacing the kitchen. "She won't let me live my own life." Ethan looked at me sadly. "Then you have to make her stop." "How?" "By choosing." The word hit me like a slap. "Choosing," he nodded. "Us or her, because right now she's winning." I stared at him. "You're asking me to pick between my husband and my mother. I'm asking you to stop letting her destroy what we have." The silence that followed was heavy. I wanted to argue, but deep down I knew he was right. For a few days I didn't call or answer Mom's texts. The quiet felt unnatural, almost wrong. She finally left a voicemail. "I don't know what's gotten into you, but ignoring me won't make your mistakes disappear." I deleted it without listening to the end. But peace didn't last. A week later, I opened the door one Sunday morning and froze. She was standing there, suitcase in hand, smiling like she owned the place. "Surprised," she said. "I thought we could spend some quality time together." Behind me, Ethan appeared, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Mitchell." She brushed past him. "Call me Evelyn, dear. This apartment is cozy." It was the start of the longest week of my life. She criticized the decor, the neighborhood, my work hours. She made passive-aggressive remarks about how some men lacked ambition. Ethan stayed patient, but I could see the strain. By Friday, I was exhausted. When Ethan suggested dinner out, she declined, claiming a headache, then called an hour later, asking me to come home because she felt lonely. When she finally left, the air in the apartment felt lighter, but something between Ethan and me had cracked open. That night, we argued, really argued, for the first time. "She's never going to stop," he said, pacing the living room. "Not until you make her." "She's my mother," I shouted back. "What am I supposed to do?" Cut her off completely. He looked at me, his eyes tired but kind. "I want to be your husband, Lauren, not the man your mother tolerates." My breath caught. "What did you just say?" His expression softened. "I'm saying I want a future with you, but we can't have one like this." In that instant, everything fell silent. The words hung between us: husband, future, choice. I didn't know it then, but that moment would mark the beginning of everything that came after the proposal, the secret, the years of hiding. That night, as I lay awake, listening to his steady breathing beside me, I whispered into the dark, "I'll fix this. I'll make it right." But I had no idea that fixing it would mean building a life my mother could never know existed. 2 months after that fight, Ethan suggested a weekend away, somewhere quiet, somewhere we could breathe. I remember the way his voice softened when he said it. Let's just disappear for a few days, he told me. No calls, no arguments, no ghosts. I didn't hesitate. We drove north before sunrise, leaving San Francisco wrapped in fog behind us. By the time the sun broke through the road, had narrowed into winding cliffs and towering evergreens, he reached over, squeezed my hand, and smiled. You ready to start over? We rented a small cottage on the edge of the San Juan Islands. It wasn't fancy, just a porch that faced the water and a kitchen that smelled faintly of cedar, but it felt like a world apart. For the first time in months, the silence between us wasn't heavy. We hiked during the day, cooked dinner together at night, and sat by the window watching gulls cut across the gray sky. On our second evening there, Ethan suggested a walk along the beach. The tide had gone out, leaving smooth stones glistening in the moonlight. The sound of the waves was rhythmic, steady, like a heartbeat. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how simple it all suddenly felt. Do you remember our first coffee? He asked, picking up a flat stone and skipping it across the water. I remember you pretending not to care about the stain on your shirt, I said, laughing. He smiled. I cared. But you looked so mortified, I thought I'd better laugh before you cried. The stone bounced 3 times, then sank. He watched the ripples fade. That was the day I knew. Knew what? That I wanted this, he said, quietly, turning toward me. All of it. You. I froze. The moonlight caught the silver in his eyes. Then slowly he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My breath caught. Lauren Mitchell, he said, kneeling on the cold sand. I have loved you since the day you spilled coffee all over my life. You are the strongest, kindest, most maddening woman I know. And I don't want to spend another minute pretending I could ever do this without you. Will you marry me? The waves seemed to stop for a moment. I nodded, the words stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. He opened the box, a simple diamond ring surrounded by tiny sapphires the color of the sea behind him, and slid it onto my finger. I love you, I whispered. I know, he said, smiling. We kissed under that cold, endless moon, and for the first time in years I felt like I belonged to something good. Something real. But even as joy filled me, a small part of my heart twisted with fear. Mom's voice echoed in my head. He'll never fit into our world. I buried that thought beneath the sound of the waves. When we returned to San Francisco, the ring gleamed like a secret. Ethan was euphoric, already talking about venues and vows, but I couldn't shake the dread building inside me. I had to tell her. It was the right thing to do, wasn't it? 3 days later, I dialed her number. Lauren, darling. Her tone was unusually bright. What a surprise. I was just thinking of you. Did you hear that Patricia's daughter got engaged? Lovely boy from Greenwich. His family owns that publishing house. You'd adore him. I swallowed hard. Actually, Mom, I have some news too. A pause. Oh, Ethan asked me to marry him, I said. And I said yes. The silence that followed was so long I thought the call had dropped. Then came her voice, cold and steady. I see. And when did this happen? Last weekend? We went up to the islands. Have you set a date? She interrupted. Not yet, but we were thinking maybe next spring. There's still time to reconsider. I gripped the phone tighter. Mom, you can't possibly be serious about marrying that man, she snapped. Lauren, Elizabeth, think about your future. Your father would be heartbroken. Don't bring Dad into this. I will if I want to, she said, her tone icy. Do you really want your children growing up without the advantages you had? Without proper upbringing, you've lost your mind? Adam isn't a mistake, Mom. His name is Ethan, she corrected sharply. And yes, he is. Something inside me cracked. He's kind, he's brilliant, and he loves me for who I am. Isn't that what you always said you wanted for me? Her voice turned brittle. I wanted someone worthy of you. I laughed bitterly. You mean someone who makes you look good? You're being emotional, she said, her words clipped. If you go through with this, don't expect me to stand by and watch you throw your life away. In fact, she paused, letting the silence stretch. If you marry that man, don't expect me to be in your life at all. The line went quiet except for the faint hum of static. I felt my knees give out, sliding down the wall to the floor. Mom, please don't do this. Her voice dropped to a whisper. If you choose him over your family, Lauren, don't ever call me mother again. Then the line went dead. I sat there for a long time staring at nothing. When Ethan came home and saw my face, he dropped his keys immediately. What happened? She said she'd disown me, I whispered. He crouched beside me, his arms wrapping around me. I'm so sorry, he murmured. She doesn't mean it, I said, though I knew she did. She'll calm down. He held my face in his hands. You don't have to choose. Not tonight. But I already had. The following days blurred together, work phone calls, tears I tried to hide. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach twisted, but she didn't call again. I told myself she needed time. Then one morning, Ethan left a note on the counter. Meet me at the beach at sunset. When I arrived, he was waiting with a small bouquet of wildflowers. Let's just do it, he said quietly. No big wedding, no drama. Just us. I stared at him, heart racing. You mean elope, he nodded. You said yourself you don't need anyone's approval, so why are we still asking for it? I looked at the waves, the horizon burning gold. Because I wanted her to love me, I whispered. He touched my cheek. Then maybe it's time to love yourself instead. That night, under a sky streaked with stars, we promised each other forever. We exchanged vows on the same beach where he'd proposed, with only his sister, her husband, and my two closest friends as witnesses. I wore a simple ivory dress. No music, no photographers, no audience. Just the sound of the ocean and the man who refused to let me face it alone. When he slipped the ring back onto my finger, I felt both free and broken. Free from her control. Broken because she would never know this version of me, the one who wasn't afraid anymore. After the ceremony, we sat by a small fire. How does it feel? Ethan asked. Like a dream, I said softly. And like I've just set my life on fire. He laughed gently. Sometimes fire's the only way to start again. We spent our honeymoon in a quiet coastal town in Oregon, exploring tide pools, hiking through pine forests, eating diner pancakes at sunrise. For that one perfect week, I let myself believe it was all going to be okay. That maybe time would soften her anger. But when we got back to San Francisco, reality was waiting. She'd left 2 voicemails while we were gone. The first one was calm. Call me, Lauren. We need to discuss this. The second one was venom wrapped in honey. You're making a fool of yourself. You'll regret this, darling. I didn't call back. I couldn't. Instead, I wrote an email, a long, careful message, telling her that I loved her, that I hoped one day she'd understand, but that I was choosing happiness. I hit send, and for the first time in my life, I didn't check for her reply. Ethan and I built a home together, small but ours. We filled it with laughter-burnt dinners and plans whispered late at night. But even in the quiet moments, I sometimes caught myself glancing at the phone, waiting for her voice to appear and destroy it all. She never called again. And so began my new life, a life built on love and secrecy. The wedding ring I once wore proudly now hung from a chain under my blouse, hidden like a sin. Every time it brushed my skin, I remembered her words. If you marry that man, don't ever call me mother again. I didn't know it yet, but those words would become the shadow trailing every joy that followed. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. I hadn't heard her voice in months. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in me still responded like a reflex. Hi, Mom, I said carefully. Lauren, darling. She began, sounding perfectly composed. You'll never believe this. I'm considering an investment in a new tech company here in San Francisco. Quite modern. You may know them. Parker Innovations. My heart stopped. My throat went dry. What did you say, Parker Innovations? She repeated casually, as if she hadn't just dropped a bomb. Some boutique software firm. The man's name escapes me. Ethan, I think. Does that ring a bell? My fingers clenched around the phone. That's interesting, I managed to say. I thought so too, she went on, oblivious to the panic rising inside me. They're presenting at a business summit at the Fairmont next week. I'll be attending. I do hope you'll join me. Perhaps it's time you got back into social circles that matter. The line buzzed in my ear. I'll see, I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. Good girl, she said sweetly and hung up. The world tilted beneath me. My husband, the man she'd disowned me for, was about to walk straight into her world without even knowing it. That night, I sat on the couch staring at the fire until Ethan came home. You're pale, he said immediately. What's wrong? She's investing, I said numbly. In your company. He blinked. My company, Parker Innovations. He laughed, not realizing. That's impossible. I would have heard wait. His smile faded. She's coming here, isn't she? She's going to that summit next week. She mentioned your name. He sat beside me, rubbing his temple. You don't think she'll recognize me, do you? She's seen pictures, I whispered. She'll know. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of the fire filled the silence. Then Ethan said softly, Maybe that's not the worst thing. I looked at him in disbelief. Are you insane? She'll ruin you. She can't ruin what's already true, Lauren. We've been hiding for years. Don't you ever get tired of it? I'm not hiding for me, I snapped. I'm protecting you. He turned to face me. From what? From being your husband. The words landed heavy, cruel, only because they were true. I didn't answer. A week later, the inevitable happened. He called me in the middle of the afternoon. It's done, he said quietly. What's done? She came to my presentation. My stomach twisted. Did she recognize you? She did, he said, his voice unreadable. She came up to me afterward, asked a few questions about our funding, and then smiled like she knew something I didn't. What did you say? I told her the truth, he said. That I was married. I pressed my hand to my mouth. Oh my God. Relax, he said quickly. I didn't say your name, but I think she suspects. Lauren, we can't keep doing this. That night we barely spoke. The quiet between us was suffocating. I kept pacing the living room, replaying every possible scenario. She'll come for me, I said finally. She'll come and she won't stop until she finds proof. Ethan reached for my hand. Then maybe it's time we stop lying. I pulled away. You don't understand her. She doesn't forgive. She dismantles. He looked at me for a long moment. Maybe she's not the only one doing that. It hit me like a slap. He didn't mean to hurt me, but he wasn't wrong. My silence, my fear, my need to keep everything contained. It was destroying us. The next day, I got an email from her. The subject line read, Dinner. I deleted it, but she texted an hour later, I'll be at your place at 7. Don't make excuses. When she arrived, I made sure Ethan was gone. He stayed at a friend's apartment, though I could see the disappointment in his eyes as he left. I'd reverted to my old pattern: manage, conceal, survive. When Mom stepped into the apartment, she scanned the room like a detective. You've redecorated, she said, setting her bag on the counter. Still a bit sparse. Could use a man's touch. I smiled tightly. Maybe someday. She looked around then at me. You seem tired. Work's stressful. It's fine, I said. She poured herself a glass of water and sat on the couch, crossing her legs. I met someone interesting at that summit, she began. Ethan Parker. Bright young man. You'd like him. Very composed. I nearly laughed. I'm sure he is. She narrowed her eyes. You're awfully calm. Usually you have more to say. I shrugged. You've never been very interested in my opinion. Don't be petulant, she said sharply. I was thinking perhaps you should reach out to him. Networking never hurt anyone. Maybe I already know him, I said, my tone slipping. She froze glass halfway to her lips. What do you mean, nothing? I said quickly. I just read about his company. Her eyes narrowed. You've changed, Lauren. There's something different in the way you talk to me. Secretive. Maybe I just stopped being afraid. She smiled thinly. Don't mistake distance for confidence. It's easy to act brave when no one's challenging you. She stayed an hour dissecting my life with her usual precision. When she finally left, I collapsed on the couch shaking. Every lie felt heavier now, every silence sharper. Ethan came home not long after. He found me sitting in the dark. "How bad was it?" he asked softly. "She met you," I whispered. "She doesn't know, but she feels it. It's only a matter of time." He knelt in front of me, taking my hands. "I love you, Lauren, but I can't keep pretending I don't exist." Tears burned my eyes. "Please, not yet." He shook his head. "If not now, then when you keep saying you'll tell her when the time's right. But the time will never be right for her, or for you if you keep living in her shadow." I looked away. "She's my mother, and I'm your husband," he said quietly. "At some point, one of us has to stop being invisible." We didn't speak for a long time after that. The next morning, I woke to find him gone. On the kitchen table sat a note: "I'm staying with Mark for a few days. I love you, but I need you to choose what kind of life you want before we lose the one we built." I read it 3 times, then folded it neatly and tucked it into a drawer. The apartment felt too quiet without him. 2 days later, she called again, her voice brisk. "I've been thinking, darling, that Ethan fellow would make an excellent husband for someone. I wonder if he's seeing anyone." I nearly dropped the phone. "He's married," I said, before I could stop myself. "To whom?" she asked quickly. The silence stretched. "You'll find out soon enough," I said, my voice trembling, and hung up. That night I stood in front of the mirror, the chain around my neck glinting softly. I pulled it out from under my blouse, staring at the ring that had lived in hiding for 3 years. My fingers shook as I unclasped it. The reflection stared back at me, a woman who was both daughter and wife, torn between 2 lives. I placed the ring on the table, its diamond catching the faint light from the window. "The lie's too big now," I whispered, "and I'm the only one still living inside it." In that moment, I realized that secrets weren't protecting anyone anymore. They were just walls I had built so high I couldn't see the people I loved on the other side. I didn't know it yet, but everything I'd been trying to keep apart was about to collide. And when it did, there would be no pretending left. I found out I was pregnant on a quiet Saturday morning in February. The sky outside our window was gray, the kind of pale light that makes everything look fragile. Ethan was still asleep, one arm flung across my pillow. I sat on the bathroom floor, staring at the test in my shaking hand. 2 lines. 2 tiny, undeniable lines. I pressed a hand to my mouth to keep from crying out. My heart raced with something between terror and awe. When Ethan woke, I was still sitting there, tears streaking down my cheeks. He blinked groggy. "Lauren, what's wrong?" I held up the test. "We're going to have a baby." He froze for half a heartbeat, then his face broke into the kind of smile that could make any fear smaller. He knelt, wrapped his arms around me, and whispered, "We're going to be parents." His voice trembled with joy, but underneath mine trembled with panic. As his arms tightened, I whispered against his shoulder, "And I'm going to be a liar. Again." The first few weeks were a blur of excitement and nausea. We whispered plans late into the night, flipping through baby name lists, talking about nurseries and futures. But underneath the joy sat a constant pulse of dread. How would I tell my mother? How could I when she didn't even know I had a husband? Evelyn called like clockwork every Sunday evening, the same way she always did. Her voice was calm, polite, and distant. "You sound different," she said one night. "Tired." "Just work," I lied. She clicked her tongue. "You should take better care of yourself. And don't forget, Lauren, you're 34. Time's running out if you want a family. You can't do everything alone." I placed a hand over my still flat stomach, tears pricking my eyes. "Maybe I already have one," I whispered after hanging up. Ethan found me standing in the kitchen, the phone still in my hand. "She doesn't know," I said quietly. He came up behind me, slid his arms around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder. "Then she's missing the best part of you." I smiled through the ache. "She'd find a way to ruin it." He kissed my temple. "She can't reach us here." "But she could. She always could." As my belly grew, so did the web of lies. Every time she called, I angled the camera higher or made an excuse to turn it off. When she asked when I was visiting next, I blamed work. I kept my ring hidden under my shirt, my secret life tucked neatly away like contraband. Ethan started painting the nursery pale yellow. I'd watch him from the doorway, his hands covered in flecks of color, humming off-key. Sometimes he'd catch me staring and smile. "She'll have your smile," he said once. "Or your stubbornness," I replied. He laughed. God help us then. At night I'd feel the first flutter of movement inside me. It felt like being tapped from the inside, like someone reminding me I was no longer alone in my skin. But every time I touched my stomach, joy was laced with guilt. When Evelyn called again, her tone was sharp. "Are you coming home for the holidays Sophie's hosting? It's been too long. I don't think I can make it. Too busy for family again. I just have a lot going on." She sighed dramatically. "I don't know what's happened to you, Lauren. You sound so detached. Don't end up one of those women who wake up at 40 and realize no one's left to care for them." I stared out the window, one hand resting on the curve that was now unmistakable. "I'll take my chances," I said softly. By the time I reached my 3rd trimester, the physical weight of the pregnancy was nothing compared to the emotional one. Hiding became harder. I stopped video calling her altogether, resorting to brief texts about deadlines and travel. Ethan was endlessly patient, but I saw the worry in his eyes. "You can't live like this forever," he said one evening. "She won't forgive me," I said. "She doesn't have to," he replied. "You don't need her forgiveness to be happy." His words were kind, but they didn't quiet the fear. Ella Grace Parker came into the world on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. 7 pounds, 2 ounces of perfection. The moment I heard her cry, something inside me shattered and healed all at once. Ethan's hand found mine, and he laughed through tears. "She's here," he whispered. "She's ours." When the nurse placed her in my arms, everything else, the fear, the guilt, the lies, fell away for a moment. Her tiny fingers curled around mine, warm and sure. "Hi, sweetheart," I whispered. "I'm your mom." The next day, I texted my mother. The message was simple: "Mom, you're a grandmother. Her name is Ella Grace. We're both healthy." Her reply came hours later. "A grandmother whose baby? Are you saying you had a child out of wedlock?" "Lauren, this is disgraceful." I didn't respond. I couldn't. She called twice that evening. I ignored both times. When I finally answered 2 days later, her voice was cold enough to frost glass. "How could you do this? Who is the father? Why am I hearing about this after the fact?" I took a deep breath. "You made it clear years ago that I wasn't welcome to share my life with you. I respected that." "Don't twist this," she snapped. "You've embarrassed this family." "There is no this family, Mom," I said quietly. "There's me, Ethan, and Ella." Her silence was heavy. "So that's how it is. You've chosen him." "I chose myself," I whispered. "And her." She hung up. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and new beginnings. Ethan was radiant, gentle, patient, the kind of father I never knew I'd need. He took photos constantly, Ella yawning, sleeping, grasping his finger. "I want her to know how much she was loved," he said. But every time he tried to post one, I stopped him. "Not online," I'd say. "Not yet." He'd sigh but nod. Still hiding, still protecting. He kissed my forehead, but I could feel the hurt beneath his silence. When Ella turned 6 months, Mom sent a package, a silver rattle engraved with EM, and a card that said simply, "Congratulations, I suppose." I left it unopened for days. Eventually, I tucked it into a box in the closet, right beside my old college diploma and my wedding veil. Ella grew quickly, her first tooth, her first giggle, the first time she said data. Each milestone felt like a miracle, but also a secret. Every time I looked at her, I wondered what kind of woman I was teaching her to become. The kind who hides or the kind who stands tall, no matter the cost. When she turned 2, we celebrated quietly. Balloons, cake, Ethan's parents' laughter. My mother didn't know. I told myself that was for the best. But that night, after everyone had left and Ella was asleep, I sat by her crib, stroking her hair. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "You deserve a grandmother who knows you." Ethan knelt beside me. "She has everything she needs," he said softly. I nodded, but tears slid down my cheeks. "I'm teaching her to lie without meaning to." He shook his head. "You're teaching her strength." I wanted to believe him. The months rolled on. My job thrived, Ethan's company expanded, and our little world felt stable again. But beneath it all was the hum of inevitability, the truth pressing against the walls I'd built. Every phone call from Charleston, every message from Mom, every holiday we skipped made the silence louder. One afternoon, while scrolling through my email, I saw its subject: family reunion invitation. It was from Sophie. "It's been too long. Mom wants the whole family together this year. Please come, everyone's asking about you." I stared at the words until they blurred. Ethan came up behind me, resting his chin on my shoulder. "What's that?" "An invitation," I said. "To the reunion." He read the screen, then looked at me. "You're not going." I closed my eyes. "If I don't, she'll call. She'll keep pushing. And I'm tired of running." He sighed. "If you go, you can't keep pretending." "I know," I said quietly. That night, after Ella was asleep, I stood at the window, the city lights shimmering below. My reflection looked older, braver, maybe even ready. For 3 years, I had lived a double life, one of love and one of fear. It was time to end one of them. I didn't know how the truth would come out, or what it would destroy, but I knew I couldn't hide anymore. I had a husband, a daughter, and a story that deserved to exist in daylight. And if my mother wanted the whole family together again, she was finally going to get exactly what she asked for. The invitation came in a cream envelope, embossed with gold lettering, the kind my mother loved, expensive, tasteful, and completely impersonal. It arrived with the morning mail tucked between bills and flyers. I knew what it was the second I saw her handwriting, looping, flawless, practiced. My heart tightened before I even opened it. Inside, in perfect calligraphy, it read: Mitchell Family Reunion, June 10th, Charleston Estate. We can't wait to have the whole family together again. The words shimmered under the light, each one polished like a command. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at them, the sound of Ella's laughter drifting from the living room. She was playing with her toy piano, tiny fingers pounding the keys, her giggles filling the house. Ethan looked up from his laptop when he saw my face. "What is it?" I handed him the invitation. He read it once, his mouth tightening. "You're not going." I tried to smile. "You know that's not how it works." He pushed the paper back toward me. "It doesn't have to work her way anymore." I sighed. "If I ignore it, she'll just find another way to reach me. Sophie's wedding now, it never ends. Maybe it's time I faced her." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "And what exactly are you going to say?" "Hi, Mom. Remember that man you disowned me over? Surprise, we got married and had a daughter. You think that's going to go well?" "No," I admitted. "But I can't keep pretending. I'm tired of living like I'm ashamed of the best parts of my life." He studied me for a moment, his expression softening. "Then, if you're doing this, you do it for you, not to fix her." I know I whispered, though I wasn't sure I believed it. That night, after we put Ella to bed, we sat in the dim light of the living room, the invitation between us. The silence stretched until Ethan said, "If you go, I can't watch you keep lying. I won't be there pretending I'm no one." I met his eyes. "You won't have to," he frowned. "Lauren, I'm not bringing you. Or Ella. Not this time." The look on his face nearly broke me. "So you're going to walk back into her world and pretend we don't exist? I just need to end this the right way," I said softly. "Once and for all." He didn't argue. He just nodded, his jaw tight, the kind of silence that said he'd given up trying to protect me from myself. The days leading up to the reunion were restless. I went through my closet, searching for something appropriate, not too plain, not too bold. Everything I owned felt wrong. I finally settled on a soft blue dress and a thin gold chain. No wedding ring. The familiar weight of my secret pressed against my collarbone, the ring still hanging beneath my blouse. Before leaving, I stood in Ella's doorway watching her sleep. Her small chest rose and felt her hair sticking out in soft curls. Ethan stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders. "You don't owe her a single truth," he said quietly. I kissed his cheek. "I owe it to myself." The flight to Charleston felt endless. When I stepped off the plane, the humid air hit me like a memory I'd been trying to forget. The city hadn't changed. Spanish moss swaying from the Oaks pastel houses lined like postcards, everything familiar and suffocating. A car waited for me at the curb, sent by my mother, of course. The driver was polite, silent, and perfectly punctual. As we turned down the long, tree-lined road toward the estate, my stomach knotted. The house loomed ahead, white columns gleaming in the sun exactly as I remembered it. She was waiting at the front door. "Lauren," she said, smiling as if nothing had happened. "You look tired. Life in California must be hard on you." "It's been busy," I said, stepping inside. The house was immaculate, crystal vases, polished floors, not a speck of dust in sight. It smelled of lilies and lemon polish. My childhood and my exile, all in one scent. "Ella, still keeping you up at night?" she asked casually, as she took my coat. The air left my lungs. "She's fine," I said slowly. "She's 3 now, isn't she?" I froze. She smiled without warmth. "Sophie mentioned something about a child in one of your Christmas cards. I assume you didn't adopt." The question was casual, but the trap was obvious. "She's mine," I said carefully. "And her father," I met her eyes. "Her father's my husband." Her lips tightened. "You're married?" "Yes." To whom I took a slow breath. "You already know." She stared at me for a long moment, her smile fading entirely. Then she laughed, soft, incredulous. "You didn't." "I did," I said quietly. The silence that followed was the kind that pulled oxygen from the room. "You've been married for years," she said finally. "And you lied. You told me if I married him I'd lose my family." Her voice sharpened. "And so you decided to prove me right?" I shook my head. "No. I decided to build one that wasn't built on control." She turned away, her voice trembling with fury. "You've humiliated me, Lauren. Do you realize what people will think?" For once I said softly, "I don't care." Her hand shot out, gripping the back of a chair for balance. "You're selfish. You've always been selfish." I laughed under my breath. "No, Mom. I spent my entire life trying to please you." This, I gestured around the room, wasn't selfish. It was survival. She looked at me then, really looked like she was seeing a stranger. The sound of a door opening broke the tension. Sophie appeared radiant as ever, her eyes lighting up. "Lauren, you came." She ran to hug me but froze when she saw our mother's face. "What's going on?" Mom straightened her composure, snapping back into place. "Nothing, dear. Just catching up." Sophie looked between us, sensing the lie but too polite to push. "Well, everyone's in the garden. Come on. You can tell us about your life out west." Dinner that night was suffocating. Relatives I hadn't seen in years surrounded me, all smiles and curiosity. "So Lauren's still single?" someone asked, laughter following like punctuation. Mom raised her glass, the queen of performance. "Some women just take a little longer to find their way." I stared at her, something cold and certain hardening in my chest. The old me would have laughed it off, swallowed the shame. But not tonight. I set my glass down, the sound sharp against the tablecloth. "Actually, I'm not single." The table went quiet. Mom's smile froze, her fingers tightening around her stemware. "Darling," she said, her tone dripping sweetness, "you don't need to make up stories. I'm not." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. "I've been married for 3 years. Gasps rippled around the table. Sophie's eyes widened. Aunt Patricia dropped her fork. Mom's voice trembled. "Lauren, this isn't the time." "This is exactly the time," I said. "You wanted the whole family together." "Well, here we are." Mom's face went pale, to whom I looked straight at her. Ethan Parker. The color drained from her cheeks. The silence was complete, the kind that felt endless. Finally she whispered, "You've made a fool of us all. No, Mom, I said quietly. I just stopped letting you make one of me. I stood, my heart pounding, and walked away from the table. No one moved. No one spoke. The air was thick with disbelief, with judgment, with something like awe. Outside, the night air hit me like a release. The cicadas hummed and the stars above the house burned sharp and bright. I breathed for the first time in years. Inside, I could hear her voice rising, commanding, breaking, but I didn't go back. I didn't need to. The truth was already out, and the weight of it was finally gone. For the first time since I'd left Charleston, I wasn't running anymore. I was walking towards something new, something mine. And I had no idea that the storm I'd just unleashed would change everything for her, for me, and for the family she thought she still controlled. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers and laughter, every inch of it curated for perfection. Crystal glasses clinked, strings played softly in the corner, and my mother glided through it all like a queen surveying her kingdom. Sophie's wedding reception was her masterpiece, the proof that the Mitchell family was still everything she wanted the world to believe. I stood near the edge of the room, invisible as ever, watching her hold court at the center of the long dinner table. It was almost comforting how predictable she was. Every gesture rehearsed, every smile deliberate. Until, of course, she turned toward me. "You know," she said suddenly, loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Some of us should take notes from Sophie. 35 and still single, Lauren. I'm starting to think I'll be dead before I get to wear another mother of the bride dress." The laughter that followed was sharp and metallic, slicing through the hum of conversation. I felt my chest tighten, my face flush, the air disappearing around me. Sophie gasped softly, "Mom, don't," but Evelyn waved her off. "Oh, relax, darling. She's used to it." I stared down at my glass, the bubbles in my champagne catching the light. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my polite smile, my nervous laugh, the usual retreat. But something inside me had finally burned out. I stood the chair, scraping against the marble floor, the sound echoing. "Actually, Mom," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I'm not single." The room froze. Forks stopped midair. The string quartet faltered. Mom's painted smile didn't waver at first. "Darling," she said with a laugh that was almost a hiss, "don't start joking at your sister's wedding." I met her eyes. "I'm not joking." The silence stretched thin like glass about to shatter. I could see the confusion flicker across her face, followed by something colder, fear. I reached up, fingers brushing the chain at my neck, and pulled it free. The ring dangled in the light, the diamond glinting for everyone to see. "I've been married for 3 years," I said quietly. Someone dropped a fork. The clatter broke the spell. Whispering started at the far end of the table and spread like ripples in water. Sophie's mouth fell open. Aunt Patricia blinked as if she hadn't heard right. Mom rose slowly, her chair scraping behind her. "This isn't funny, Lauren. It's not meant to be," I said. She stared at the ring, her lips parting. You lied to me. You gave me no choice." Her voice trembled with rage. Who, before I could answer, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. The sound of footsteps echoed on the marble floor, steady and certain. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Ethan's voice cut through the murmurs. "Sorry I'm late." All heads turned. He stood framed in the doorway, calm in his gray suit, his eyes finding mine instantly. The light from the chandeliers caught his wedding band as he adjusted his tie. He crossed the room slowly, the crowd parting like water. Mom's face went white. He smiled politely. "Good evening, Mrs. Mitchell. What are you doing here?" He stopped beside me, his hand resting lightly on my back. "I'm here for my wife." The room erupted, gasps, whispers, a flurry of motion. Sophie pressed a hand to her chest, her new husband's jaw fell open. Mom stood frozen, her fingers trembling against the edge of the table. "You married him," she whispered. "Yes," I said softly. 3 years ago, on the beach in Washington. It was beautiful, even without you there." Her breath caught fury, replacing shock. "How dare you humiliate me like this? In front of everyone, you did that yourself," I said, my voice steady. Every time you called me a disappointment, every time you made my love something to be ashamed of, you did this." The chatter around us swelled. I could hear someone mutter, "That's the Parker guy, his company's worth millions," but it didn't matter. For once the power in the room wasn't hers. Mom's hands shook as she gripped her glass. "You've embarrassed this family." I met her gaze. "No, Mom. I just stopped hiding the truth." She slammed the glass down so hard it splintered. "Get out." The music had stopped completely now. Every eye in the room was on us. Ethan's voice was calm. "If that's what you want, we'll go." I looked at her one last time. "You always said I'd embarrass the family one day. Looks like you were right." Her face twisted, but she said nothing. Ethan took my hand and we turned toward the doors. The crowd parted again, silent, reverent, as if watching a scene from a play they hadn't expected to see. When we reached the exit, Sophie's voice called softly behind me. "Lauren." I turned. She was standing, tears in her eyes. "You look happy," she said. "I am," I whispered. Outside the night air was cold and clean. I hadn't realized how stifling the ballroom had been until that moment. Ethan squeezed my hand. "You okay?" I let out a shaky laugh. For the first time in years, yes. We walked across the courtyard, the sound of distant voices fading behind us. The fountain shimmered under the moonlight, and I caught our reflection in the water, two people who'd finally stopped pretending. Ethan looked at me. "You didn't have to do that for me?" "I didn't," I said. "I did it for us, for her to see she doesn't own me anymore." He smiled softly. "You were incredible in there." "Terrified but incredible," I corrected. He laughed, his breath visible in the cool air. "I love you, Mrs. Parker." I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his hand against my back. "I love you too." We stood there for a while, listening to the muffled chaos inside. I imagined my mother's voice rising, her perfect image crumbling as the truth sank in. For once I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. As we walked to the car, the weight I'd carried for years lifted piece by piece. The lie was over. The secret was gone. Whatever came next, it would be real. Ethan opened the car door for me, but I paused before getting in. The mansion loomed behind us, glowing in the distance, a monument to everything I'd once feared. I thought of the girl who grew up inside those walls, the girl who mistook control for love, obedience for peace. I whispered to her, "You made it out." Ethan touched my arm gently. "Let's go home." I nodded, climbing into the car. As we pulled away, I didn't look back. In the rearview mirror, the lights of the estate grew smaller until they were nothing but fireflies in the dark. Revenge hadn't been loud or cruel. It had been quiet, a single act of truth delivered at the perfect moment. My mother had spent her life trying to orchestrate every scene, every smile, every secret. Tonight, she lost control of the story. And for me, that was justice enough. The next morning, I woke to sunlight spilling across the bed and the faint hum of the city outside. For the first few seconds, everything felt normal, peaceful, even until I checked my phone. 22 missed calls, 12 voicemails, 16 unread texts, all from my mother. I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, the familiar dread curling in my stomach. Ethan stirred beside me, his arm sliding around my waist. "Don't look," he murmured, still half asleep. "Not yet." I hesitated. "What if she's angry?" he said softly. "She's always angry. Let her be." He kissed my shoulder and got up to make coffee, leaving me alone with the silence I wasn't ready to face. I scrolled through the messages anyway. Most were exactly what I expected. "How could you do this to me? You've humiliated your entire family. Don't ever show your face here again." But one was different. Short, simple. "You made your choice. Don't bother calling me when it falls apart." I stared at those words until they blurred. My chest ached, not from guilt anymore, but from finality. There was no more pretending, no more performance. The bridge was burned. When Ethan came back with 2 mugs, he didn't say anything. He just handed me mine and sat beside me, his knee brushing mine. So he said quietly, "Do we regret it?" I shook my head. "No. I just didn't expect it to hurt this way." He took my hand. That's how freedom feels at first. We spent the rest of the day in silence, moving slowly through the house, each of us lost in thought. That evening, after Ella was asleep, we sat on the couch watching the sun disappear behind the hills. For the first time in years, I didn't have to hide the ring around my neck. It was back on my finger where it belonged. "She'll come around eventually," Ethan said gently. I smiled faintly. "You don't know her," he chuckled. "Maybe not, but I know you. And you're not your mother's mirror anymore." His words lingered long after he went to bed. I stayed up late scrolling through photos on my phone. Ella's first birthday, her messy face covered in frosting, Ethan holding her up to the light. My mother wasn't in a single one. The next day, my phone buzzed again. A new number this time. It was my Aunt Patricia. "Lauren, sweetheart," she said when I answered. "I just wanted to tell you good for you." I blinked. "For what?" "For standing up to her," she said, voice warm and firm. "Everyone's been talking about it. You should have seen her face after you left. No one's ever done that to Diane before." I laughed, a shaky, unexpected sound. I didn't mean to cause a scene. "Oh, darling, sometimes a scene is exactly what people need. It's about time someone showed her she's not the sun we all orbit." Her words loosened something in my chest. "Thank you. She won't call you for a while," Patricia continued. "She's too proud. But don't mistake her silence for peace. That woman's been rearranging her version of the truth since the moment you walked out that door." "I know," I said quietly. "She always does. But listen," she added, her tone softening. "Your father would have been proud of you. I mean that. That night I dreamed of him, of sitting at the old kitchen table while he smiled at me across a cup of coffee. 'Just be yourself, Haley Bear,' he used to say when Mom's expectations pressed too hard." The nickname, something she'd always hated, floated back to me like a ghost of gentleness. When I woke, the world outside, our window was washed in pale light. Ethan was already up making breakfast, while Ella toddled around his legs with her stuffed rabbit. For a moment, watching them together, I felt like I'd stepped into the life I'd been fighting for all along. Days turned into weeks. My mother didn't call, but others did. My cousin Jessica reached out on social media. "Your story is all over the family chat," she wrote. "Honestly, good for you." Uncle James sent an email that simply read, "Proud of you. Always was." Each message stitched something back together inside me. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address, but I knew the handwriting instantly. Precise, elegant. My stomach tightened as I slid it open. "Lauren," it began, "I have spent my entire life protecting this family from scandal. You have no idea what it's like to be the one everyone expects to hold together. Perhaps I pushed too hard, but I did it for you. You may not believe that now, but one day you will understand." I read it twice. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it wasn't pure venom either. There were cracks in the armor. The last line caught me off guard. "Tell your daughter her grandmother wishes her well." Ethan found me reading it at the kitchen counter. "Good news, I'm not sure," I said, folding the paper carefully. "But it's something." He nodded. "Maybe it's the start of her realizing she can't control you anymore." I looked out the window at Ella, chasing butterflies in the yard. Maybe. Summer turned to autumn. Work picked up again. Life settled into a rhythm, school drop-offs, dinners with friends, evenings spent laughing on the porch. The drama of that night in Charleston began to fade, replaced by something quieter, stronger. But sometimes, usually late at night when the house was silent, I'd think about my mother alone in that enormous house, surrounded by everything she valued except the people who once loved her. I wondered if she ever looked at the empty seat where I used to sit and felt even a flicker of regret. One Saturday morning, the doorbell rang. Ethan was out running errands, and Ella was coloring at the table. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door and froze. She was standing there. My mother, not dressed for battle this time. No pearls, No perfect hair, no painted armor. Just jeans, a pale sweater, and tired eyes that looked older than I remembered. "Mom," I breathed. "Lauren," she said quietly. "May I come in for a second?" I didn't move. Then I stepped aside. She walked into the house, her gaze moving over the walls, lined with photos, me, Ethan, Ella. Our life, her absence. "It's lovely," she said finally. "Warm." I waited for the insult that always came after the compliment. It never did. "Coffee?" I asked. She nodded. We sat at the table, the same one where Ella had spilled orange juice that morning. Silence hung between us until she said, "You look happy." "I am." She nodded slowly. "I wanted to see her," she said. "My granddaughter." I hesitated, then called softly, "Ella, sweetheart, come here." Tiny footsteps pattered across the floor. Ella peeked around the corner, her curls bouncing. My mother smiled, really smiled for the first time in years. "Hello, darling," she said gently. "I'm your grandma." Ella blinked, then climbed onto my lap. "Grandma," she repeated, testing the word like it was new. "Yes," Mom whispered. "Grandma." Something in her voice cracked, and I saw it, the smallest fracture in her wall of pride. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something softer. After she left that day, I stood in the doorway watching her car disappear down the street. Ethan came home soon after, and I told him what happened. He just smiled. "Told you she'd come around." I leaned against him, exhaling deeply. Maybe not all the way I said, but enough. The house was quiet again, sunlight stretching across the floor. Ella was humming softly to herself, and in the corner of the room, my mother's coffee cup sat half full, forgotten but real. It struck me then that some endings don't arrive with fireworks or apologies. Sometimes they just arrive in the form of silence that no longer hurts. And for me, that was more than enough. It's been a year since that morning my mother showed up at my doorstep. A year since the silence between us shifted from punishment to possibility. Sometimes when I catch her in the garden with Ella kneeling in the dirt, her manicured hands clumsy with the tiny shovel, I almost forget the years of venom and distance. Almost. We've rebuilt something, but not what it was. What we have now is quieter, more fragile. It's built on boundaries, not obedience. Respect, not fear. I don't know if she'll ever fully understand the damage her expectations caused, but I've stopped needing that. Understanding isn't forgiveness. It's simply a place to rest. Every Sunday she comes for dinner. The first few times were stiff and formal. She'd sit straight backed at the table, comment on the food, compliment Ella's manners, and say nothing about Ethan. But slowly the armor began to crack. The first time she asked Ethan about his work, his surprise was so obvious, I nearly laughed. He told her about the new software launch his team was developing, and she listened, actually listened, without correcting or dismissing him. That night after she left, Ethan turned to me and said, "She's trying." And she was, in her own awkward way. Sometimes she'd slip back into her old habits, offering suggestions about Ella's education or our modest home. But when she did, I no longer shrank. I'd smile gently and say, "Mom, that's not your decision." And for the first time in my life, she'd stop. Sometimes she even apologized. The day everything changed for real came on Ella's 4th birthday. The house was filled with balloons, laughter, and the smell of chocolate frosting. Mom arrived early carrying a photo album wrapped in gold paper. "For Ella," she said, handing it to me. "So she knows where she comes from." I didn't know what to expect when I opened it later that night. Inside were pictures of me as a child, mud on my knees, paint on my hands, eyes bright and unguarded. Photos I hadn't seen in years. At the very back was one of Dad holding me in his arms at a park, both of us grinning into the camera. Underneath, in her looping handwriting, she'd written, "He would have been proud of you." It was the first time she'd ever acknowledged that out loud. I called her the next morning. "Thank you," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I should have let you be happy sooner," she said softly. "Your father used to say I confused control with care." Maybe he was right. He was, I said, smiling through tears. "But you're here now. That's what matters." After that, our Sundays felt different, lighter somehow. She started bringing her own dishes to dinner, and for the first time in my memory, she laughed easily. Not her practiced social laugh, but something real, something almost shy. One evening after dessert, Ethan walked her to the car. I watched them through the window as she said something that made him smile. When he came back inside, he kissed the top of my head. "She just told me she was wrong about me," he said quietly. I looked up at him stunned. "She did," he nodded. "Then she said she's glad you didn't listen to her." I laughed, a sound filled with both disbelief and relief. "I never thought I'd live to hear that." He smiled. "Maybe people can change." Maybe they can, I thought. Or maybe they just get tired of fighting the wrong battles. As the months passed, the bitterness between us faded into something resembling peace. We never spoke of that night at Sophie's wedding or the years of lies before it, but the silence between us no longer felt dangerous. It felt earned. Sometimes I'd find her and Ella in the garden, both of them covered in soil, giggling about worms. Watching them together, I'd feel something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging that didn't require performance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, I joined her outside. She was sitting on the patio, a cup of tea in hand, watching Ella chase fireflies. "She reminds me of you," she said. "Careful," I teased. "You used to think that was a bad thing." She smiled faintly. "It was never bad. I just didn't understand it." We sat in silence for a while, the warm air buzzing with life. Finally, she turned to me. "You were right, you know, about everything. I wanted perfection so badly, I forgot to love the person right in front of me." I swallowed hard. "You did what you knew, Mom. You can stop apologizing now." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "Still, I'm sorry for making you afraid to be yourself." It wasn't the grand apology I'd fantasized about, but it was real. And that was enough. Later that night, after she'd gone home, I tucked Ella into bed. She looked up at me with her sleepy, innocent eyes and whispered, "Grandma said, 'You're really brave, Mommy.'" I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She said that Ella nodded. "She said you always tell the truth, even when it's scary." I smiled, tears catching in my throat. "I try to." When I went downstairs, Ethan was waiting on the couch, a glass of wine in his hand. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, sitting beside him. "I think I am." He handed me his glass. "You did it, you know. You broke the cycle." I leaned against him, resting my head on his shoulder. "Maybe. Or maybe I just finally stopped living in it." He kissed the top of my head. "Either way, you gave Ella something better." We sat there quietly, the sound of crickets drifting through the open window. I thought about everything we'd lost and gained, the battles fought, the secrets buried and unearthed. My life wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Sometimes I still think about that night at Sophie's wedding, the frozen smiles, the gasps, the silence after my confession. I used to replay it in shame. Now I see it for what it was, the moment I stopped letting fear write my story. If you'd told me back then that my mother would one day sit in my kitchen laughing with my husband, helping my daughter bake cookies, I would have called it impossible. But here we are, broken people learning to be whole again. A few weeks ago, she gave me one last surprise. We were clearing out boxes in her attic when she handed me an envelope with my name on it. Inside was a letter she'd written years ago but never sent. It began, "If you ever stop speaking to me, know that I love you anyway, even if I don't know how to show it." That night, I sat alone on the porch and cried, not from sadness but from relief. For years, I thought healing meant erasing the past. Now I understand it means carrying it differently. Lighter. With grace. As I write this now, Ella is asleep upstairs, her laughter still echoing faintly down the hall. Ethan's in the kitchen, cleaning up, humming off-key like he always does. And on the windowsill sits a framed photo of the three of us taken last Christmas, Mom, standing beside us, her hand on my shoulder, her smile soft and unguarded. I look at that photo sometimes and think this is what victory looks like. Not revenge, not vindication, just peace. If you've ever had to choose between your family's expectations and your own happiness, I know how hard it is. I know how lonely it feels. But trust me, the life waiting on the other side of fear is worth every step it takes to get there. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to stand up to someone you loved and what it taught you. And if this story reminded you that honesty can be the most powerful form of love, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because sometimes the hardest stories to tell are the ones that finally set us free.